Even the wisest can fall. How did Solomon, the man blessed with wisdom and riches by God, lose it all? In this final episode, we explore the most tragic chapter of Solomon's life, his mistakes, their consequences, and the lessons we can take from his downfall.
I am Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, a man once known for his wisdom, wealth, and devotion to God. Mine was a reign of unparalleled prosperity. My people lived in peace, my name was praised across nations, and rulers from distant lands sought my wisdom. Yet, for all my knowledge, for all my insight, I was not immune to the shadow that follows every man: pride. In my youth I prayed not for riches or power, but for wisdom, and the Lord granted it abundantly. Through his guidance I judged disputes with fairness, built a temple that stood as a testament to his glory, and united a nation under his name. My kingdom flourished, and with it so did my heart's confidence. But therein lies the danger of success. When a man's achievements grow too great, his humility begins to wither. I began to believe the whispers of the world more than the whispers of the Lord. They called me the greatest of kings, and I allowed myself to think it was true. My palace grew larger, my possessions multiplied, and my alliances expanded through countless marriages with foreign queens and princesses. What began as a political strategy soon became personal indulgence. The Lord had warned me, "Do not turn to foreign gods, Solomon. Do not let your heart stray from me." But the temptations of power, beauty, and wealth are subtle and persistent. One step at a time, I began to compromise. I permitted altars to gods I did not know, I bowed to customs I did not understand, and I let my heart be drawn away from the one who had given me everything. This is the story of my rise and my fall, of how wisdom can be clouded by pride, and how even the greatest of kings can lose sight of the true king. The palace stood as a beacon of all I had accomplished, its golden walls shimmering in the early morning light. From its high terraces, I could look out over Jerusalem, a city alive with the hum of life, its streets bustling with merchants, farmers, and families who now knew peace in a land once torn by war. My throne, carved from ivory and overlaid with the purest gold, seemed immovable, symboling the wisdom and strength that had built this kingdom. Envoys arrived daily bearing treasures from distant lands: gold from Ophir, spices from Sheba, fine linens from Egypt. These gifts, heavy with wealth, reflected the reputation I had built. They called me the wisest king in the world, a ruler blessed by God himself. Foreign rulers sought my counsel, traveling for months to hear my words. My name carried weight across seas and deserts, whispered in awe by those who had never seen my face. Yet, as I stood there, basking in the world's admiration, I did not see the shadow growing behind me. Pride is a subtle enemy. It does not strike suddenly, but grows quietly, wrapping itself around a man's heart until he believes he is untouchable. I remember the day the first seed of that pride was planted. A messenger arrived, his robes dusted with the sands of Egypt, bearing gifts from Pharaoh's court. Among the treasures of gold and ivory was Pharaoh's daughter, her beauty as radiant as the rising sun over the Nile. She carried herself with the grace of a queen, her eyes sharp, and her smile calculated. To marry her seemed a wise choice, an alliance that would secure Israel's southern border and strengthen ties with one of the most powerful nations in the world. At first I convinced myself it was purely political, a marriage of convenience, not of the heart. But her presence stirred something in me, a curiosity, a fascination with the world beyond Israel. She spoke of the gods of Egypt, their temples vast and glittering, their priests cloaked in mystery. Her words were soft and alluring, and I found myself listening longer than I should. The marriage was celebrated with great pomp, a feast that stretched into the night. My advisors raised their goblets, toasting to the wisdom of their king, yet I caught the faintest hesitation in the eyes of the priests. They knew, as I should have, that this was not the path the Lord had intended for me. But I dismissed their unease. Was I, not Solomon, God's chosen? Had he not blessed me with wisdom beyond any man? Surely I could navigate this path without falling. Surely I could balance my devotion to the Lord with the alliances that ensured my kingdom's prosperity. Pharaoh's daughter became the first, but would not be the last. The allure of foreign alliances grew stronger, and with each marriage my kingdom expanded, not just in territory, but in influence, in wealth. My wives brought the treasures of their homelands, jewels that sparkled like the stars, fabrics softer than spring winds. They also brought their customs, their gods, and their prayers whispered to deities I did not know. I told myself it was harmless, a gesture of respect for their traditions. After all, I worshipped the Lord, the God of Israel. What harm could there be in allowing them their shrines and rituals? But the heart is deceitful, even when it belongs to a king. The first altar was small, almost unnoticeable, a modest stone structure tucked into a quiet corner of the palace gardens. Pharaoh's daughter had requested it, her voice soft and persuasive. "It is but a place for me to honor the gods of my fathers," she said, her eyes holding mine. "You have your temple, Solomon. Grant me this, and I will ask for nothing more." At the time it seemed like a small concession, a harmless gesture to show respect for her heritage. I told myself it would not interfere with my worship of the Lord, that it was merely an act of diplomacy. The Lord, I reasoned, knew my heart. What harm could there be in granting her this small thing? But compromise, I have learnt, is not a single act. It is a path, winding and subtle, that leads a man further than he ever intended to go. The first altar was followed by another, and then another. Each time it seemed easier to justify. My wives from Moab and Ammon approached me, their voices filled with longing. "Solomon," they said, "will you not allow us a place to honor Chemosh, to offer prayers to Milcom?" I hesitated, but only briefly. "Very well," I replied, "but these shrines must remain outside the city walls." It felt like a compromise I could control, a boundary to keep the foreign gods at a distance. And yet, the altars multiplied. On the high places outside Jerusalem, shrines to gods I did not know began to rise, their smoke mingling with the prayers of my people, Chemosh, Ashtoreth, Milcom, and others whose names I could barely pronounce. They all found a place in the land the Lord had given us. At first I avoided these places. I told myself I was still faithful to the Lord and that my hands were clean. But love, no, infatuation drew me in. One evening, at the urging of my Sidonian wife, I climbed the hill where an altar to Ashtoreth stood. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense, the flames casting eerie shadows against the night sky. She stood beside me, her voice low and melodic as she chanted prayers to a goddess I did not understand. "Join me," she whispered, her hand resting lightly on mine. "Show me that you honor my gods, as I honor yours." I did not kneel, I did not speak, but I stood there, silent, my presence an unspoken permission. The spread of compromise. The priests of the Lord came to me, their faces lined with worry. "My king," one of them said, his voice trembling, "these altars must be torn down. The Lord has commanded us to worship him alone. Do you not remember the covenant he made with your father David?" I bristled at his words. "Do you question my devotion to the Lord?" I demanded. "I built the temple, the very dwelling place of his name. Have I not offered sacrifices and led the people in worship?" The priest lowered his gaze but pressed on. "Your actions, my king, are leading Israel astray. The people see these altars and wonder if they too should bow to these gods. The elders—" I dismissed him with a wave of my hand. "The people know where my loyalty lies," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Yet the priests were right. The altars were no longer confined to the high places or the palace gardens. They began to creep into the lives of my people. Farmers whispered prayers to Chemosh for good harvests. Merchants lit incense to Ashtoreth before their journeys. Slowly, imperceptibly, the faith of Israel began to fracture. The weight of indulgence. One night, I walked through the palace gardens, the moonlight casting long shadows over the paths I had walked so many times before. I came upon an altar I had not seen before, a shrine to Milcom, its stone darkened by the smoke of countless offerings. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. This was no longer a harmless concession. It was a betrayal of the covenant I had sworn to uphold, a betrayal of the God who had given me wisdom, power, and peace. And yet I could not bring myself to tear it down. My wives, my queens, they would not understand. They would see it as an act of disrespect, perhaps even of rejection. Their love had become a chain, binding me to decisions I could not undo. I turned away from the altar, my steps heavy with the weight of my choices. In the distance, the temple of the Lord stood tall, its golden walls gleaming even in the darkness. I thought of the day I had dedicated it, the prayers I had offered, the promises I had made. And now, here I was, a man divided, a king whose heart was no longer fully his own. Reflection and regret. Looking back, I see now that the altars were not just physical structures. They were symbols of my compromise, of a heart that had begun to stray from the Lord. Each one marked a moment when I chose the desires of others over the commands of God. And so I ask you, what altars have you allowed to rise in your life? What compromises have crept into your heart, pulling you away from the path you once walked with conviction? The Lord is merciful, but He is also just. Do not let the small concessions of today become the chains of tomorrow. Learn from my mistakes and guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. Wisdom, when untethered from obedience, becomes fragile, a house built on sand. For many years, I was known as the wisest king to ever live, and I believed it. I trusted my ability to judge, to reason, to navigate the complexities of life and rule. But what I failed to see was that my wisdom was never my own. It was a gift from the Lord, a gift that required humility and faithfulness to sustain. As the years passed, I began to notice the cracks in my understanding, small at first but growing wider with each compromise. The clarity I once had, the sharp, unshakable insight that came so easily, began to fade, dulled by the choices I had made. The test of the riddle. One day, a foreign delegation arrived at my court. Their leader was a man of imposing stature, his robes embroidered with patterns unfamiliar to me. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had crossed great distances, certain that his task would challenge the king who claimed wisdom beyond all others. He approached my throne, his voice loud and commanding as he spoke. "King Solomon, we have heard of your wisdom, of your ability to unravel mysteries and discern truths that elude other men. I bring you a riddle, one that no man has yet solved. If you are truly as wise as they say, you will answer it." Solomon said, "My lord, I believe that nobody is so sure of the future. If you are correct, I will answer it." I leaned forward, intrigued but wary. Once I would have welcomed such a challenge with eagerness, certain that the answer would come as effortlessly as the rising sun. But now, doubt whispered at the edges of my mind. He recited the riddle, his words flowing like the twists of a river. "There is a thing that walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening. What is it?" I paused, my brow furrowing. The court fell silent, every eye fixed on me. My advisors, who had grown accustomed to my quick and confident responses, exchanged uneasy glances. The answer was not far. It hovered in the recesses of my mind, just out of reach. The clarity that had once defined me felt distant, clouded by the weight of my own choices. I hesitated, and at that moment the foreigner smirked, sensing my struggle. Finally the answer came to me. "It is man," I said, my voice steady despite the delay. "In the morning of life, he crawls on all 4s as a child. At noon, he walks on 2 legs as an adult. And in the evening, he leans on a staff, walking with 3 legs as an old man." The court erupted in murmurs of relief and awe, but I felt no satisfaction. The pause had been too long, the struggle too great. For the first time, I questioned whether my wisdom, once so effortless, was beginning to slip away. a kingdom growing restless. The challenges did not end with riddles. Reports began to filter in from across the kingdom, whispers of unrest, murmurs of dissatisfaction. The peace I had long cherished began to fray at the edges. Neighboring nations, emboldened by what they perceived as my growing weakness, stirred with rebellion. Edom and Moab, long subdued under Israel's might, began to challenge my authority. Within my borders, discontent brewed. My grand projects, the palace, the temple, and now the foreign altars, had come at a cost. The people who once praised me now murmured about the heavy taxes and the labor demanded for my endless building. I convened my advisors, their faces tense with worry. One of them, a man I trusted deeply, spoke cautiously. "My king, the people grow weary. They whisper that the wealth of the kingdom serves only the palace, that their toil has become a burden too great to bear." I dismissed his concerns with a wave of my hand. "They forget," I said, "that their labor is for the glory of Israel, for the temple of the Lord, and the strength of our nation. These sacrifices will be remembered for generations." But even as I spoke, I felt the weight of my own words. Were they for Israel's glory or my own? The fog of compromise. The wisdom I once wielded like a sword now felt more like a dull blade. I began to second-guess decisions that had once come easily. The clarity that had guided me as a young king, that had inspired awe in rulers and brought peace to my people, now seemed shrouded in a fog of my own making. The foreign altars weighed heavily on my conscience. I knew they were wrong, an affront to the God who had blessed me, but I could not bring myself to tear them down. My wives, my alliances, my pride. Each one bound me tighter to the compromises I had made. One evening, I stood in the shadow of an altar to Chemosh, the god of Moab. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning offerings, the flames casting eerie shadows that danced on the stone. I thought of the temple I had built for the Lord, its golden walls and sacred spaces now tainted by the knowledge that I had allowed this. "What have I done?" I whispered, the words barely audible over the crackle of the fire. But the answers did not come. Where once I had felt the Lord's presence so strongly, there was now only silence. Question for the soul. In the quiet of my chambers that night, I wrestled with the truth I had long tried to ignore. Wisdom, true wisdom, is not a thing of the mind alone. It is rooted in the fear of the Lord, in obedience to His commands. Without Him, my knowledge, my discernment, my insight, it was all vanity, like chasing after the wind. I looked at the scrolls that filled my library, the records of judgments I had rendered, the laws I had written, and the treaties I had secured. They were the marks of a wise king, but they now felt hollow. I asked myself, what good is wisdom if it leads a man to compromise? What good is power if it serves only to build altars of pride and folly? And now I ask you the same. What compromises have you allowed to creep into your life? What altars have risen in the corners of your heart, pulling you away from the path you once walked with conviction? Wisdom is not enough without faithfulness. Clarity is nothing without humility. Guard your heart, for from it flows the wellspring of life. The words of the prophet Ahijah came like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. He stood before me in the great hall of my palace, his face as stern as the judgment he carried. The court fell silent as his voice echoed through the chamber, heavy with the weight of divine displeasure. "Solomon," he began, his tone unyielding, "the Lord is angry with you. You have turned your heart away from him. You have built altars to foreign gods and allowed Israel to stray into sin. The Lord says this, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant or my statutes, I will tear the kingdom from your hands and give it to your servant." The words struck me like thunder, reverberating in my chest. For a moment I could not breathe. The court remained frozen, my advisors exchanging uneasy glances, but saying nothing. They dared not interrupt the voice of the prophet, or the silence that followed his pronouncement. When I finally found my voice, it was filled with indignation, though even I could hear the tremor beneath my words. "The Lord has blessed me," I declared, rising from my throne. "Look at what I have built. The temple, the peace of Israel, the wealth of my kingdom. Has any king before me done more to honor him?" Ahijah's gaze did not waver. "The Lord does not delight in gold or grand monuments," he said. "He delights in obedience. You have disobeyed him, Solomon, and allowed your heart to be divided. For this, the kingdom will be torn from you. Yet, for the sake of your father David, the Lord will not do this in your lifetime. It will be your son who bears the weight of your choices." The unraveling. Ahijah's words haunted me, though I did not show it. In the days that followed, I tried to go about my duties as if nothing had changed, as if my own will could silence the judgment of the Lord. I presided over disputes in the court, issued decrees, and met with foreign envoys, but the certainty I had once ruled was replaced by an unease I could not shake. The Lord's displeasure began to manifest not just in the words of the prophet, but in the very fabric of my kingdom. The peace that had long defined my reign started to fray. Reports of rebellions stirring in the south, of Edom and Moab testing the borders with increasing aggression. My generals assured me it was nothing they could not handle, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Closer to home, whispers of dissatisfaction grew among my people. The grand projects that had once united, Israel, my palace, the temple, the fortifications of the city, now weighed heavily on them. Taxes were high, and the labor demanded of them seemed endless. One day, a trusted advisor approached me, his voice hesitant. "My king," he said, "there is unrest among the people. They say that the wealth of the kingdom serves only the palace, that their toil has become a burden too great to bear." I dismissed him with a wave of my hand, though his words lingered in my mind. "The people forget," I said, more to myself than to him. "Their labor is for the glory of Israel, for the Lord himself. These sacrifices will be remembered for generations." But even as I spoke, I felt the weight of my own hypocrisy. The altars of foreign gods still stood, their smoke rising into the heavens, a silent testimony to the division of my heart, a moment of reckoning. One evening I found myself alone in the palace gardens. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in hues of red and gold. The air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and myrrh, but it brought no comfort. I wandered among the paths, my thoughts tangled in regret and denial. I came upon an altar I had not seen before, a shrine to Molech, its dark stones stained by the smoke of countless offerings. I stared at it, my heart sinking. This was no longer just about my wife's traditions. This was a rebellion against the God who had given me everything. The words of Ahijah returned to me. "The Lord does not delight in monuments. He delights in obedience." I fell to my knees before the altar, not in worship but in anguish. "Lord," I whispered, my voice trembling, "forgive me. I have strayed so far from your ways. My heart is divided, my hands unclean. Do not take your mercy from me." But the silence that followed was deafening. The presence of the Lord, which I had felt so strongly in my youth, seemed distant now, obscured by the smoke of the altars I had allowed to rise. The weight of prophecy. Though I prayed for forgiveness, I knew the consequences of my actions were already in motion. The Lord had spoken, and his words would not return void. I thought of my father, David, whose heart had remained steadfast despite his failings. He had sinned, yes, but he had repented with a depth of sorrow that brought him back to the Lord. I, too, had sinned, but my repentance came too late. The altars stood as monuments to my pride, and their smoke would not be easily cleared. The prophecy of Ahijah weighed heavily on me. My son Rehoboam would inherit a kingdom divided, not by war, but by the choices I had made. The unity of Israel, the peace I had worked so hard to maintain, would crumble under the weight of my compromises. I tried to turn back, to undo what had been done. I ordered some of the altars destroyed and banished certain practices from the palace, but the seeds of rebellion had already been planted. and they would bear their bitter fruit long after I was gone. Lastly, here's a question for the heart. As I reflect on these days, I ask myself, how did I, Solomon, the wisest of kings, fall so far? The answer is not a mystery. It lies in the small compromises, the subtle shifts of the heart that seemed harmless at first, but grew into something I could no longer control. And now I ask you, where is your heart divided? What altars have risen in your life, pulling you away from the path you once walked with conviction? The Lord is merciful, but He is also just. Do not wait until the weight of regret presses you to the ground. Seek Him now, while your heart is still soft, for if even the wisest king can fall, none of us are immune to the pull of pride and the whispers of temptation. The weight of the Lord's judgment grew heavier with each passing day, an invisible but unrelenting force that shadowed every step I took. Though I continued to sit upon my throne, adorned in robes of majesty, I could feel the kingdom slipping through my fingers. The words of the prophet Ahijah echoed endlessly in my mind. The kingdom will be torn from your hands and given to your servant. At first, I tried to silence the fear by burying myself in my duties. I presided over disputes, issued decrees, and met with foreign envoys. Yet, for all my efforts, I could not ignore the cracks forming in the foundation of my reign. What once had been a kingdom united under the Lord's favor was now a nation fracturing under the weight of my pride and compromises. Rebellion at the borders. Reports of unrest came frequently, each one like a stone added to the burden I carried. Edom, long subdued by my father David, had begun to stir with rebellion. Moab too tested our borders, its people emboldened by whispers of Israel's growing weakness. "My king," a general said during a meeting in the palace war room, "we can quell these uprisings, but the cost will be great. Our men grow weary, and our resources are stretched thin." I clenched my fists, unwilling to accept the fragility of the peace I had so long prided myself on maintaining. "Send the troops," I commanded. "We cannot allow rebellion to take root." The general hesitated, his face shadowed with concern. "And what of the unrest within our borders, my king? The people speak of heavy taxes and unending labor. They say the weight of the kingdom falls on their shoulders while the palace grows ever more splendid." I dismissed his concerns with a wave of my hand. "The people will endure," I said, though I could feel the unease spreading like a shadow in the room. "Their sacrifices are for the glory of Israel, for the legacy of their children." But even as I spoke, I knew the truth. The legacy I had built was crumbling, its foundation eroded by the altars and alliances I had allowed to take root. I began. I think it was fracturing of faith. The unrest among the people was not just political, it was spiritual. The altars I had permitted, the shrines to foreign gods that now dotted the high places, had sown confusion and division among my people. In the markets and fields, farmers whispered prayers to Chemosh for a bountiful harvest. Merchants lit incense to Ashtoreth before embarking on their journeys. Even my servants, once steadfast in their faith, began to falter. One evening, I overheard two of them speaking in hushed tones outside my chambers. "Does the king still worship the Lord?" one asked. The other hesitated before replying. "He built the temple, didn't he? But these days it seems his heart is no longer with the God of Israel." Their words stung more deeply than I cared to admit. I wanted to call them in, to rebuke them, to assure them that my loyalty to the Lord remained. But how could I? My actions had spoken louder than any words I could offer. A moment of reckoning. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered the palace gardens. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of jasmine and myrrh, but it brought no comfort. The silence of the night was broken only by the faint crackle of flames in the distance. One of the altars to a foreign god that still stood on the high places outside Jerusalem. I found myself standing before an altar I had allowed to be built for Chemosh, the god of Moab. The sight of it filled me with a deep and abiding sorrow. This was not just stone and fire. It was a monument to my failure, a symbol of the compromises that had led me so far from the Lord. I fell to my knees, my hands gripping the earth as tears streamed down my face. "Lord," I whispered, my voice breaking, "forgive me. I have strayed so far from you. I have allowed my heart to be divided and my hands to build what should never have been built. Do not take your mercy from me." The silence that followed was deafening. Where once I had felt the presence of the Lord so strongly, there was now only a void, a reminder of the distance I had created between us. The weight of prophecy. Ahijah's prophecy returned to me with unrelenting clarity. "The kingdom will be torn from your hands and given to your servant. Yet, for the sake of your father David, this will not happen in your lifetime. It will be your son who bears the weight of your choices." I thought of my son Rehoboam, who would inherit a throne burdened by rebellion and division. What kind of kingdom was I leaving him? What legacy would he carry? The unity of Israel, the peace I had worked so hard to maintain, would shatter under the weight of my compromises. Already inability to customize, and the gradual collapse of monarchies. I, my family, and my child had seen an increase in evil. I tried to turn back, to undo what had been done. I ordered some of the altars destroyed, forbade certain practices, and sought to restore the people's faith in the Lord. But it was too late. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, and they would bear their bitter fruit long after I was gone. Question for us all. As I reflect on these days, I ask myself, how did I, Solomon, the wisest of kings, fall so far? The answer is not a mystery. It lies in the small compromises, the subtle shifts of the heart that seemed harmless at first, but grew into something I could no longer control. And now I ask you, what altars have you allowed to rise in your life? What compromises have crept into your heart, pulling you away from the path you once walked with conviction? The Lord is merciful, but He is also just. Do not wait until the weight of regret presses you to the ground. Seek Him now while your heart is still soft. For if even the wisest king can fall, none of us are immune to the pull of pride and the whispers of temptation. In my later years, the grandeur of my reign no longer brought me comfort. The palace, once alive with the sounds of laughter and celebration, now felt hollow. Its golden walls and ivory throne stood as reminders not of my triumphs but of my failings. The temple of the Lord, the crown jewel of my achievements, still shone in the light of the Jerusalem sun, but even it seemed distant, a reflection of the covenant I had betrayed. The pain of looking back. I spent long hours alone, walking through the palace gardens or sitting by the windows that overlooked the city. I would stare at the hills surrounding Jerusalem, where the altars of foreign gods still stood, their smoke rising like accusations into the heavens. Each one was a scar, a reminder of the compromises I had made, of the steps that had taken me further from the Lord. I thought often of my father David. He had sinned, yes, but his heart had always returned to God. He repented with a depth of sorrow that drew him closer to the Lord, even in his failures. My repentance, though sincere, came too late. The damage was already done. The Lord's words through the prophet Ahijah weighed heavily on me. "The kingdom will be torn from your hands and given to your servant. Yet for the sake of your father David, this will not happen in your lifetime. It will be your son who bears the weight of your choices." I thought of my son Rehoboam, who would inherit my throne. What kind of kingdom was I leaving him? What kind of father had I been? I had built for him a legacy not of strength and unity, but of division and rebellion. The division begins. The signs of division were already evident. My people, once united in their devotion to the Lord, were now fractured. Many had turned to the gods of Moab, Sidon, and Ammon, worshipping Chemosh and Ashtoreth at the altars I had allowed to be built. Others, faithful to the Lord, looked upon my reign with disillusionment. Within the palace, the tension was palpable. My advisors, once confident in my decisions, now spoke in cautious tones. Their trust in my wisdom eroded. My foreign wives, whose beauty and allure had once captivated me, now felt like strangers. Their gods, their customs, their demands. They had driven a wedge not only between me and the Lord, but between me and my people. I ordered some of the altars torn down, trying to undo the damage I had caused, but the people saw my actions for what they were: too little, too late. The seeds of rebellion had already been sown, and I could feel the unity of Israel slipping through my fingers. Words of reflection. In those days of solitude I wrote. I poured my heart into words, hoping to capture the lessons I had learned, even if it was too late for me to live by them. Vanity of vanities, I wrote. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. I realized that all my wealth, all my achievements were meaningless without the Lord. The wisdom I had been given was not mine to squander. It had been a gift, entrusted to me to guide His people and reflect His glory, not my own. I reflected on the early days of my reign when I had prayed for wisdom with a pure heart, seeking to serve my people with justice and fairness. How far I had strayed from that prayer, allowing my pride to blind me, my desires to lead me astray. To wait until the future. As I neared the end of my life, I thought often of the legacy I would leave behind. The temple, the palace, the wealth of Israel, all of it would fade. Or remained, would be the division I had caused, the fractures that would shatter the kingdom after my death. And yet, even in my regret, I found moments of clarity. I realized that the greatest wisdom is not in building monuments or acquiring wealth, but in fearing the Lord and keeping His commandments. For without Him, even the greatest achievements are but a breath, a fleeting shadow. I ask you now, as I ask myself then, what are you building with your life? Are you creating something that will endure, or are you chasing after vanity, after things that will fade? Do not wait, as I did, until it is too late to turn back. Seek the Lord, while your heart is still soft. Tear down the altars of pride, of compromise, of divided devotion. For if even the wisest king can fall, none of us are immune to the pull of temptation. In the twilight of my life, the splendor of my reign seemed like a distant dream. The gold of my throne, the walls of my palace, even the sacred temple of the Lord, all of it felt like a fragile shell, unable to shield me from the weight of my regrets. I had built much, yet I had destroyed even more. My wisdom, once celebrated as divine, now felt like a hollow echo in the chambers of my mind. Crown of thorns. The crown I wore was no longer a symbol of honor. It had become a burden, pressing into me with every thought of the kingdom I would leave behind. My advisors came to me with their reports, but I could barely focus on their words. Rebellion stirred at the borders, and within the walls of Jerusalem, dissatisfaction festered. I looked out over the city from the high balcony of my palace. The streets were busy, the marketplace alive with the sounds of merchants and laborers. Yet, beneath the hum of daily life, I could feel the tension, the strain of a people carrying burdens they no longer wished to bear. I had taxed them heavily to fund my ambitions. The palace, the temple, the shrines to foreign gods, all of it had been built on their backs. They had given their labor, their loyalty, and their faith, and I had rewarded them with division and disillusionment. A kingdom divided. The unity that had defined Israel in the early days of my reign was gone. Where once my people had stood as one, worshipping the Lord in His temple, they now splintered into factions. Some clung to the God of Israel, praying for deliverance from a king they no longer trusted. Others turned to the gods of Moab, Sidon, and Ammon, drawn by the altars I had allowed to rise. The temple I had built, the very house of the Lord, still stood as a beacon of His presence, yet its light was dimmed by the shadows of my failures. I had brought idols into the land, foreign gods that mocked the covenant I had sworn to uphold. The people saw this, and their faith faltered. I thought often of my father David. He too had sinned, but his heart had always returned to the Lord. His repentance was pure, his devotion unwavering. I envied the clarity of his faith and the strength of his relationship with God. I, Solomon, had been given everything: wisdom, wealth, power. Yet I had allowed my heart to be divided. The weight of lost wisdom. The wisdom I had once cherished now felt like a curse. It showed me with painful clarity the consequences of my choices and the depths of my failure. I saw the cracks in my kingdom, the seeds of rebellion that would sprout into division after my death. Ahijah's prophecy haunted me. The Lord will tear the kingdom from your hands and give it to your servant. Yet, for the sake of your father David, this will not happen in your lifetime. It will be your son who bears the weight of your choices. I thought of Rehoboam, my son. He was young, untested, and arrogant. He would inherit my throne, but not the unity or strength that had once defined it. I had burdened him with a fractured kingdom, a people divided by faith and resentment. What legacy had I truly left him? A voice in the silence. One night, unable to sleep, I walked through the halls of my palace. The air was heavy with stillness, broken only by the faint flicker of torches along the walls. I found myself in the chamber where I kept the scrolls of my writings, the judgments I had rendered, the proverbs I had spoken, the prayers I had offered in the days when my heart was still fully devoted to the Lord. I unrolled one of the scrolls, my hands trembling as I read the words I had written in my youth. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. How far I had fallen from that truth. I had feared the approval of my wives, the alliances of foreign nations, the allure of wealth and power. Everything but the Lord. My wisdom had turned to folly because I had forgotten its source. He opened his eyes. I fell to my knees, the scrolls slipping from my hands. Lord, I whispered, my voice breaking, forgive me. I have squandered the gifts you gave me. I have led your people astray. Do not turn your face from me, even now. The silence that followed was profound, yet in it I felt the faintest stirrings of his presence. It was not the overwhelming nearness I had known in my youth, but a whisper, a reminder that his mercy is never beyond reach. Final lesson. In my final days I wrote words that I hoped would outlive my failures. They were not for kings or priests, but for all who would hear them. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes, and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. I wanted the people to see what I had learned too late, that wealth, power, and ambition are fleeting, empty pursuits without the fear of the Lord. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. These words were my confession, my plea to those who would come after me. They were the wisdom of a man who had tasted the bitterness of regret, who had seen the folly of a divided heart. The question for the ages: what is consciousness? As I look back now, I ask myself, how could I, Solomon, the wisest of kings, have fallen so far? The answer is simple: pride. Pride blinds the heart, deafens the ears, and convinces a man that he is greater than the one who made him. And now I ask you, what is the crown you wear? Is it a crown of obedience, rooted in faith, or a crown of pride, built on compromise?" Unquote. Do not wait, as I did, until the weight of regret presses you to the ground. Tear down the altars in your life while there is still time. Seek the Lord with your whole heart, for his mercy is great, and his forgiveness is unfailing. Let my story be your warning. Even the wisest of kings can fall, but even the most broken heart can find its way back to the Lord," said the peasant. "Wisdom alone is not enough to shield a man from temptation if he forgets the Lord. My fall is not just the story of a king. It is a cautionary tale for all of us. I was given everything: wisdom beyond measure, a kingdom at peace, and wealth unmatched by any ruler. Yet I allowed my heart to stray, seduced by pride, indulgence, and compromise. The altars I built for foreign gods were not just stones. They were symbols of my divided devotion, my failure to honor the God who gave me all I had. My regret is deep, but my prayer is that my story serves as a warning. What will you do when faced with temptation? Will you have the strength to remain faithful to your values, to the God who calls for your whole heart? Remember, loyalty and humility are the true crowns of life. Without them, even the wisest man can fall.
And so Solomon's journey comes to an end, but the lessons from his life endure forever. What part of his story made you reflect the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more meaningful stories from the wisdom of Solomon. Thank you for joining us on this journey.